Good morning and welcome to the 16th meeting in 2020 of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. I'd like to move to the first item on the agenda, which is a decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to consider taking items 5, 6 and 7 in private. This is to allow the committee to discuss its future work programme and its approach paper to pre-budget and financial scrutiny, and also its approach to the Dogs Protection of Livestock Amendment Scotland Bill. Are members agreed? If anyone disagrees, please indicate now in the chat room. No one's indicated, so I take it we are agreed, and therefore I'm going to move on to agenda item 2, which is the impact of COVID-19 on agriculture, fisheries, aquaculture, food and drink. The committee today is taking evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on the agriculture, fisheries, aquaculture, food and drink sectors from stakeholders. And I'd like to welcome our panel. Firstly, I'd like to welcome James Withers, the Chief Executive of Scotland Food and Drink, Julie Hesketh-Laird, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation, David Oxley, the Director of Business Growth, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Jimmy Buchan, the Chief Executive Officer of Scottish Seafood Association, Johnny Hall, the Director of Policy of the National Farmers Union Scotland, Elspeth MacDonald, the Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, and Nick Harfide, the Interim Chief Executive of the South Scotland Enterprise. Now, before we go any further, I would just like to ask members if anyone would like to declare an interest. I know some members will, so the order I'm going to take them in, I'll do mine first, I'll come to Peter Chapman, I'll then come to Stuart Stevenson and then Rachel Hamilton. If anyone else would like to indicate that they want to register an interest, please do. I refer members to my register of interest in that I have an interest in a farming business and a freshwater fishery. Peter Chapman.
Thank you, Convener. I also need to register an interest as a partner in a farming business in the northeast of Scotland.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson.
I have an interest in a very small registered agricultural holding and derive no income from it.
Thank you, Stuart. And Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Convener. I would like to refer members to my register of interest that I am a shareholder in a small hospitality business in the Borders.
Thank you, Rachel. No one else has indicated they want to register an interest, so we're going to move on to questions. But before I do, could I just please remind everyone, if you keep your questions succinct and your answers succinct, then we'll get through the quite considerable amount of questions that we have got. So I'm going to move to the Peter Chapman, who has got the first question. Peter.
Thank you, Convener, and I welcome the panel to our meeting today. And my question is in two parts, and my question is for the representatives, the three representatives of the fishing industry. So it's to Elspeth MacDonald, Jimmy Buchan, and Julie Hesketh-Laird. And the question is that, you know, the committee and I would like to hear from you, from all three of you, what problems and impacts the COVID-19 has caused your industry. And if you have any figures and costings to back that up, that would be very useful. However, we are actually more interested in looking forward rather than back. So the second part of the question is what lessons can we learn, and can we all learn, and how can we get back to normality, and how can we learn from this crisis? So probably the second part is more important than the first part, but the first part is also very interesting. We need to know how the COVID has affected your industry. So I don't know who wants to go first amongst that three, but
well, don't incite a riot to start. Don't incite a riot to start with, Peter. The way I'm going to tackle that is I'll go to Elspeth first, followed by Julie, and then come to Jimmy. So Elspeth, if you'd like to start off on that.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, committee, and thank you for this opportunity to come and talk to you this morning. The fish catching sector has obviously been fairly significantly hit by the COVID impact. It was early, and it was in parts of the industry we were hit pretty hard, particularly in the shellfish fleet. Obviously a very high reliance on the hospitality and food service sectors, both at home and abroad, for our shellfish product. So I think fair to say that was the part of the fleet that was hit most severely. And I think now when we look back at the period since the lockdown in the UK, it's fair to say that the prawn fleet in particular has been the most significantly hit. We're currently catching probably half the volume of prawns that we were this time last year for half the price. So the impact has been very significant. There was also a significant and early impact on the inshore shellfish fleet, so the smaller vessels catching some of the live product being exported live, lobsters, crabs, prawns, etc. But also significant impacts in our whitefish fleet. That part of the fleet managed to keep fishing, but it's fair to say that there was a significant reduction in activity. And I think when you look at the landings in Peterhead market, for example, from the period March to May this year and compare them with the same period last year, landings were down about 40%. So that's significant. And obviously Peterhead market had to put measures in place to limit the landings that they could handle, obviously due to social distancing requirements, etc. So significant impacts on the fishing sector. The market has been very volatile. As I say, whilst there has still been a market for whitefish, it has been very up and down. It's been very unpredictable, and it has been hard to plan landings to meet demand. And I think that almost brings me on to the second part of Mr. Chapman's question. I think something that we've certainly learned from these last few months is that there's been very good communication and collaboration, I think, across the supply chain, try and manage what's been a really difficult situation. So I think that's certainly something that the sector will learn from in terms of what the market conditions are and trying to ensure as far as possible that we are managing effort in a way that is able to respond to what the market situation is. I think too it's shown to us the very high reliance that the industry has on the hospitality sector. I don't know that there's a lot that we can necessarily do about that in the short term, but I think about 55% of the UK seafood market is food service and hospitality. So because that has been obviously completely closed over the last few months, not just in the UK but also abroad, where there's a very good demand for our product, that's had a really significant impact upon us. So it's been a very difficult few months, I say, a very variable impact across the fleet, depending on whether you're in whitefish, shellfish, or indeed the pelagic sector, which has been largely unaffected thus far. And I think a lot to learn, a lot to reflect on, but I think there has been very good collaboration across the supply chain.
Okay, Elspeth, I'm going to go to Julie next, and then to Jimmy. Julie.
Morning, convener. Morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity here. The salmon farming sector was hit quite early on by COVID. Of course, the Chinese market began to slow down significantly in January, China being our third biggest market for farmed salmon exports. So we felt the impact very early on, with other markets closing quickly afterwards. With the lack of export opportunity, farmers had to very quickly manage their farms slightly differently. We've got fish in the water, that are up to 2 years old, and fish welfare as well as people's welfare has been really important throughout the COVID outbreak. So farmers worked really quickly, rapidly to put measures in place to look after their fish, to ensure that work patterns were going ahead using minimal number of people so that social distancing could be put in place. So there were a lot of on-farm impacts. We worked very quickly with the regulators to make sure that the fish welfare issues could be dealt with quickly. And the industry has worked pretty resiliently and not as normal because of social distancing, but they've carried on working tirelessly throughout the COVID outbreak to keep fish healthy and to keep the industry moving as a food sector. The government quickly scrambled to say that it was an essential business, so the industry, got carried on getting stuck in to keep providing fish for the UK market. The UK retail sector has done reasonably well, in fact, pretty well indeed, actually, for us throughout this, as people stockpiled quite early. And fresh salmon sales have had a small uptick, so we've done well in the UK, but only roughly half of what we produce is for the UK market. Exports have been really hit badly. US, China, and France have been, really hit because of the food sector closures there. We don't yet have, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but I don't have data to the specific question on that, but it is beginning to come through. How do we get back to normality was one of the questions. Well, the industry's been working really hard all the way through all of this. They will carry on doing what they do well. But for us, the priorities are really getting UK restaurants and hospitality back open. It's a big market for us in the UK. Getting passenger flights going back out to our major markets is really important because farmed salmon travels mainly in the belly of passenger planes. So the more passengers that travel, the more salmon will go too. So if passenger flights resume as the markets open, that's going to be really important, and it will help to bring the important freight costs down to a much more affordable price to our members. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Convener,
Jimmy, briefly. Can I just bring Jimmy in, and then I'll come back to you, Peter, and Stuart Stevenson wants to come in. So Jimmy first, Stuart, and then back to you, Peter. Jimmy.
Thank you.
Yeah, good morning all. Thanks for the opportunity to engage and share my views with the wider panel. Just a quick reflection on what the two previous speakers spoke about. Shellfish was worst affected, I would say, and continues to be affected. So that is a real concern because we've still got the scallop and the prawn processors pretty much lying low, and that is purely because it's an export product. And until we see hospitality really moving in some sort of volume, that's going to continue. I think on top of that, these businesses were already sitting on what we would class as a very good harvest the previous year. So they were already sitting with quite high frozen stocks, which now means that the financial constraints means they really need to move some of their inventory first to create, two reasons: to create cash flow and to create a possible room in their cold stores to be able to go and buy more. That is a knock-on effect on the catching fleet. So that side of it is quite difficult. There has been sporadic problems with whitefish exports, but I think what we learned from that was that it was mainly into France, and France was running 2 to 3 weeks ahead of where the rest of the United Kingdom was. So their problems reflected into us at a later stage. By and large, fish is moving into France now, but I still think there are some small issues there. But I think a couple of things that I think we could have learned from this COVID outbreak was I felt there was lack of clear guidance for food producers in that initial stages. There was total confusion. We didn't know if we were key workers, we weren't key workers, we weren't given the correct guidelines quick enough, and therefore a lot of businesses went into shutdown when possibly there was no need to do that, only to find out 2 to 3 weeks later they were back trying to get started again. So I think a clearer, concise set of rules would have helped each business to be able to make the assessment rather than this grey, kind of woolly situation where some remained open and some didn't. So, but I think the most important thing is, yes, we live and learn from the past, but I think we've got to move forward, and this is with both Scottish and UK governments, in a post-COVID, post-Brexit scenario. So we'll learn from the past, but we've got to really start to focus on what we need for the food and drink sector and my particular brief for seafood processing going forward. And that is to me is the key thing I would like you guys to take away from this. Is we're past the lip service, we're past the talking shop. We now need action. We are within 6 months of Brexit happening, and we still don't know what the future holds for us. But the one thing that business does not like is uncertainty, and right now that's what we're sitting with. So that's my message to the panel.
Thank you, Jimmy. Stuart, you wanted to come in very briefly, I think, with a question. Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Kavina. It's just a very quick question, I think only for Elspeth. It's just to ask if, given that a lot of the catch in our territory is by foreign vessels, whether the SFF have any understanding of the effect of COVID on other nations, particularly those that fish in our waters.
Elspeth, briefly.
Thanks. Yes, that's a good question. We certainly know that French vessels were continuing to land into Scottish ports during the height of the problems, if you like. I think our understanding is that certainly the fleets on the continent were experiencing very similar problems in terms of volatility in their own marketplace. The very significant downturn in hospitality and the impact that had, and I think certainly there were some signals, maybe at some point during May, I think, when our market was particularly difficult to predict, where there seemed to be some trouble getting Scottish product into France, and that was, I think, because of French processors putting pressure on their retailers to only be stocking French product. So I think it's fair to say that the continental fleets in other countries that were affected by the outbreak have faced very similar problems to our own.
Okay, Peter Chapman, I would come back to you if I may now. Peter.
Thanks, convener. And if I may, I have a short supplementary for all three panel members. And to go to Elspeth first. You said that the whitefish was down about 40%, down at about 40% landing over the last 3 months. What's the most recent figures? I mean, in the last 3 weeks, for instance, are we managing to take up that to a higher level? And the other thing is that it was very interesting how the fishermen have worked together to manage the market. Is that still working for the whitefish fleet?
Just before I go to Elspeth, I think I might try and bring in James Withers very briefly. James, could you give us, I think you're indicating you've got some figures on the impact to fishing, the financial figures. James, can I bring you in briefly and then I'll come to you, Elspeth?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Morning all. It's actually beyond fishing. It's a total impact across farming, fishing, food and drink. So the sector is a £15 billion industry, as the committee will know. Our latest estimate is that COVID will wipe around £3 billion off the value of the sector in 2020. That's based on a combination of things we know just now, which are the first quarter's export figures, as well as our assessment of how much of the food service and hospitality sector that Elspeth rightly identified as being the critical problem of the last few months, how much of that is closed just now. I should say that estimate is probably at the more optimistic end of the spectrum based on what some of the government economists are seeing, and it's also based on a gradual unwinding of restrictions and reopening, and doesn't factor in a potential return to restrictions or indeed a second wave. So we think about a £3 billion total impact in 2020 across the whole industry.
Okay, thanks, James. I'm going to come briefly now to Elspeth and Julie and Jimmy to give them a chance to answer that, but I'd ask them to do it briefly, please. So, Elspeth first.
Yes, thank you, convener. As I mentioned, the landings to Peterhead market, which is the biggest whitefish market, not just in Scotland, but I think also in Europe, were down 40% between March and May this year compared to last year. But I think obviously there are other markets where fish is landed in Scotland. We've got markets on the west coast and on Scrabster and also in Lerwick. So I think across the piece, the landings were probably down in the region of 30% overall. I think there was quite a sort of geographic difference. I think we saw that the North Sea fleet was probably a bit more significantly hit than the West Coast fleet. They were managing to continue to fish the Rockall haddock stock, and there was an ongoing market for that. So that meant that the West Coast fleet could keep going. I think I don't have the figures immediately in front of me, but it is fair to say that the whitefish fleet activity has increased over recent weeks. There are more boats back at sea. Peterhead Market has been able to relax some of the measures that they had put in place. They had set a 5,000 box a day limit at the outset of the pandemic, which is down reduced by half, because they could usually handle 10,000, and they've raised now their box limit several days a week. So the whitefish market is picking up. Landings are increasing, and there was certainly activity during May in particular, where the industry worked with the government to put in place an 8-day tie-up scheme, again, just to try and manage effort. And however, we haven't felt it necessary to do that in June.
Thanks very much, Elspeth. And I really do mean this, Julie and Jimmy, if we could keep it brief. Julie, to you first.
I'm not sure I have an answer to the question, because I think the question was about landings, but I'm not sure if Peter had a different question for me. Yeah,
basically my question to you, Julie, is there any plans in the industry to cut production in the near future, given the difficult situation you've got with the market? Are some of the growers planning to cut back a bit for the next, 6 months, a year or so?
The thing about growing salmon is that they take 2 years to grow. So if we'd have needed to cut the production, we'd have done that 2 years ago. So we've got salmon growing kind of in the farming pipeline, as it were. Companies will be looking closely at what markets are going to reopen and hope to sell into those emerging markets. The Chinese food scare has really been a problem for us, because things were really starting to move there, and then suddenly things have stopped dead again in the Chinese market. Undoubtedly, companies will be looking at their hatcheries and the number of fish that they put into the marine environment in due course. But I don't have figures for that. But it's really we are very hopeful that we will get through this crisis using all of the fish that are in the water in a variety of different ways, be they in market to different markets. Food boxes into, kind of different parts of the UK food service sector.
Thank you. I do realise it's a long lead-in time. And finally, if I may convene it to Jimmy. Jimmy, how many processors do you know that are still shut down? And do you believe that some of them may never reopen? Or what's the situation with the processing industry right now?
Jimmy, well, briefly, please.
Yeah, we've still got a number of processors in shutdown. These would be primarily the shellfish guys, just simply because the market is not there, and we've just got to live in hope that the tourism will pick up across Europe and globally, and people will start moving more freely, which will put people out in restaurants and such like. So that's a possibility. I think most whitefish processors are now back in some sort of capacity, but certainly not in full capacity, because until the food service opens up, then that will restrict any opportunities. But with England now starting to open up, I would expect demand to now increase, and hopefully we're never going to get back to normality soon, but it's an improving picture. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. And we're going to move on, but can I just say before we do move on, I'm sure we've all welcomed the availability of fish boxes, fresh fish boxes, which now seem to be available in Scotland to allow us to enjoy the fish that have been landed. So I know that it's difficult times, but to my mind, has been a definite step forward. Richard Lyle, yours is the next question. Richard.
Thank you, convener. My question is actually to Johnny Hall, firstly. During the lockdown, farmers and crofters have had to cope with fly tipping, irresponsible outdoor access, initial closure of markets. I'm sure there are many more which you'll tell us about, including beef and dairy prices. What has been the main effects of COVID-19 on agricultural sectors, and how has the impact of COVID-19 been distributed across the agricultural sector?
Johnny Hall.
Thanks, convener. Thanks, Richard, for the question. Good morning, everyone. I would sum up the agricultural farming situation as there has been no single impact that has affected our industry. However, when you drill down into the different sectors of Scottish agriculture, whether it be dairying, beef, lamb, soft fruit production, specialist crops, cereal sector, they've all experienced different impacts, largely due to supply chain issues, particularly early on in the lockdown situation, but equally, similarly around the availability of people to work on farms as well. And I'll come to that. That's particularly affected the ornamental sector and the veg sector and the soft fruit sector. I'll go back a step to the first real impacts of the lockdown for the agricultural sector wasn't about the supplies beyond the farm gate and ensuring that the supply chain continued to function. It was actually to do with all the many services and businesses that provide the inputs to agricultural businesses. We were at a critical point in the year in terms of March being the start of spring work, calving, lambing, sowing of cereals and all the rest of it. And at that point, there were grave concerns about the availability of seed, feed, fertilizer, fuel, even down to things like the availability of sawdust, because sawmills closed, and things like the availability of sawdust, animal welfare issue for those that use sawdust. Even ongoing now is the availability of PPE for those who would use PPE all year round in pigs and poultry units, etc. So a vast array of different challenges and issues. A huge number of businesses provide services or inputs to the agricultural sector across the rural economy. And because agriculture was largely enabled to keep going as one of the critical national infrastructure components, I think the impacts have been largely okay for the wider rural economy. I would echo some of the concerns said earlier on about the slower provision of guidance or the lack of clarity about guidance about social distancing and appropriate measures to be put in place to ensure that social distancing was robust and demonstrable in various situations. But we've obviously engaged very much with Scottish Government on that and other agencies. And I think that is now well and truly settled. If you then look at different sectors, I think clearly the dairy sector had some very short-term, hard-hitting impacts as we switched out of drinking lots of milk via Costa coffee houses, etc., and it all being about retail. So depending on which sort of contract and which processor you were aligned to, that had different impacts. I think Scotland, in comparison to certainly the southeast of England, fared far better. And I think we're now over that particular challenge. At one point, we were facing the prospect of empty supermarket shelves for milk at the same time as the prospect of some dairy farmers actually having to pour milk away, which seemed ridiculous. The lamb price collapsed, but then recovered very quickly. The beef sector has gone through a number of challenges, partly through having to realign the sector. I can see the convener wagging his finger at me already, so I better make this quick. I think some of the ongoing concerns around the cereal sector we're still to really understand because of the slowdown, but not necessarily the full stopping of the distilling sector. And the possible overhang of supplies of grain already in store, and we're about to hit the harvest of certainly spring barley next month, and so on. So where we will be in October still remains to be seen. And I'll come finally to soft fruits in particular, and obviously the availability of people to actually harvest fruit and veg was very, very important indeed, and that remains an ongoing issue because we're right in the crunch time of that. So yeah, variable impacts. Going back to the original question, a huge range of sort of knock-on consequences around agri-tourism, fly tipping, access, Lots of other things I could mention, but I hope they're pretty much documented in the briefing that we've given.
Yeah, I have to say,
Richard.
I take it. Yeah, I have to say,
Sorry,
I take
Richard.
on board. Yeah, I take on board what you're saying, Johnny. But hindsight's a wonderful thing, and this has been unprecedented. A situation that no one basically could have. The whole world been shut down. Basically, no one could have foresaw this, and we've all had to grapple with it. But in the fullness of time, you've covered many issues there. Can you tell us, have you been made aware of any particular impacts on Crofton or tenant farming sectors?
I don't think there are any particularly separate or different issues facing the crofting or tenant farming sectors as opposed to just mainstream agricultural businesses. Nothing's been raised. We have a significant crofting membership. We have a significant tenant farming membership. Those sectors or those types of tenure face their own challenges, but I don't think they have been adversely or excessively impacted by COVID-19 related impacts over and above mainstream businesses.
As I say, I thank you for what you've told us. No one could have planned for this, but I think you've really coped well. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Rick. Thanks very much, Richard. And I'm going to come on to Emma, who's got the next question. So I'm going to try. I'm sorry, I hate doing this, but I implore everyone to keep their answers short so I can keep bringing them back in on more questions. Any help you can give me will actually end up with you getting more airtime. So Emma, if you'd like to go with your next question, please.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. I found the submission from NFU very helpful, actually, and I won't talk too much about it, and I'll go straight to my questions pretty much. Johnny Hall has talked about supply chain already, and that interests me because there was supply chain issues even pre-COVID. I know dairy contracts is an issue. I think it's something that the Cabinet Secretary is picking up, and I know we've been talking about supply chains, not just local but national and then EU as well. So I'm interested in what needs to be done in the future to future-proof so that when we do have a second spike or any future pandemics, this is something that we didn't plan for. We didn't have an on-the-shelf guidance, but now we will know how to better prepare so that we can secure our supply chains in the future. So I'm interested to hear what we can do about that.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Emma. We'll come to James Withers to start with. James.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I think, there are some, lessons that will be learned. None of us were prepared for this, and I don't mind holding a hand up and say our organisation wasn't either. I do think my assessment would be that the response was pretty remarkable, I have to say, particularly as industry, government agencies and many others working collectively together to try and tackle things as quickly as possible. There are some lessons straight away. I can relate to some of Jimmy's comments about the early days. The key worker issue was a mess in Scotland in the early days, where you had it left to 32 local authorities to determine if the food processing sector, for example, was deemed key and essential. So you had some plants who might draw their workforce from 5 different local authorities. 2 of them would have them as key workers who could get access to childcare, 3 wouldn't. But I think the advantage was the mechanisms were pretty good to try and tackle that early and collectively and get them addressed as we go. I do think that many of the issues that you refer to there, Emma, supply chain, for example, all COVID has done is shone a light on issues that were already there. Access to labour, our balance of markets, the balance of hospitality versus retail, domestic versus export, and certainly equity in the supply chain. Recovery will be critical now, and pace of recovery will be critical. And I think actually a lot of industry bodies working really closely on a recovery plan now, and investment in that will help ensure we accelerate our recovery at the same pace as a lot of our competitor countries. And to be honest, we know what we need to do.
Okay, Convener, do you want me to carry on, or are we seeking info from anyone else? Okay. Sounds as if we might have lost the convener, folks. Does anybody else want to come in on Emma's questions? Yes, Jimmy.
And whilst you're getting the things sorted out, no, I would reflect on what James said there. I think the industry, various industry bodies, really worked well. We had seafoods, and as seafood specific, with Scotland Food and Drink, we had Seafood Scotland, we had ourselves, we had SFF, and basically we were.
I think your mic's gone, your connection's frozen, I think, Jimmy. We'll try and get it back.
Okay.
Does anyone else want to come in? James Withers, do you have anything on the supply chains or from your angle?
Yeah, I think Johnny was actually looking to come in, so I'll yield my time, Maureen, if he wants to raise a point there, because I know Emma asked him a specific question, I think.
Yes, please, if that's
okay, Johnny. Yeah.
Am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah. I mean, I would echo very much what I would echo very much what James has just said about shining a very clear light on existing challenges that supply chains face across different sectors and different commodities. And I think that there are lessons to be learned, and we need to learn this pretty quickly. I think there's an awful lot of fragility out there in the way we do manage food supply chains. Just-in-time management seemed to collapse pretty quickly when all of a sudden you had to realign things from prime cuts of Scottish beef going into what was a food service sector, all of a sudden becoming a significant demand for mince on the shelves of Tesco's or other supermarkets, etc. So I definitely believe that we have to learn lessons from that. I'm not 100% sure that we'll fix it overnight, but one thing that James touched upon was about equity in the supply chain. I think not only do we need equity or fairness, if you like, in the supply chain, we also need transparency in the supply chain, and that goes across all sectors.
Can I come back, please, Deputy Convener, or is Convener back? Yeah, of course, Emma, and I'll hand back to Edward after this. I think he's back. Thank you. Right, thanks for your responses. It occurs to me that I should have declared an interest, Convener, because I am also a partner in a small bed and breakfast business. And when we're talking about milk and milk for retail versus milk for hospitality, that obviously is an issue that is something that I'm familiar with. I'm also interested in our fruit growers and the people picking the fruit. So now we've got quarantine issues with persons coming into the country that are normal folks that will pick our fruit, and so I'm sure that has challenges as well. And so it would be interesting to hear a little bit about that.
Okay, who'd like to come back on that? Johnny, you'll come in briefly, I think.
Yes, thanks. Obviously, the challenges around the workforce, particularly for soft fruits and veg, has rumbled on throughout the piece. Initially, we thought that we might plug the gap of the lack of seasonal workers coming over because of travel restrictions, etc., through the fact that there were a significant number of people furloughed. We set up various portals, if you like, for people to make contact and express an interest in working on farms, particularly in Angus and Fife and places like that. A lot of people expressed an interest, but an awful lot of those people then didn't follow through in terms of making themselves available. So at some points there were real issues around the availability of a workforce able and capable of picking fruit in particular. We've overcome that to a significant degree with the movement of folk. Emma Harper raises the issue around quarantine. We've managed to overcome that with Public Health Scotland and others that has enabled units of folk coming in to essentially be quarantined as a unit, but still able to work on farm, etc. And that's all been done with Scottish Government's input too. So it hasn't been as challenging as it could have been. So I think through a lot of cooperation. We have got to the situation whereby at this peak moment in demand for people, we are in a reasonably good place.
Thanks very much, Johnny, and thank you, Maureen, for stepping in and filling out. Obviously, one of the big problems that we've all faced is connectivity, and no more so in the Highlands. I thought I'd had the system rebuilt yesterday in preparation for today, but it's obviously failed. So, Maureen, hopefully that will be the only time, but you may need to step in again. John Finney. John, yours is the next question.
Thank you, Convener. Convener, my questions are on rural enterprise, so I think direct them to both the gentlemen from there, Mr. Oxley and Mr. Halfide. Mr. Halfide's organisation, clearly a baptism of fire coming into creation at the start of or during the pandemic there. Gentlemen, you, in addition to your ordinary work, there's a range of funds here. I have a list in front of me, the Pivotal Resilience Fund, you're referring people to Third Sector Resilience Fund, the Wellbeing Fund. I wonder, are you in a position to outline what your assessment of how rural communities and rural businesses have fared during the pandemic and what particular issues rural enterprises have faced, please?
We'll come to David Oxley first, David, and then Nick Halfide afterwards. David.
Yeah, thank you, Convener, and thank you, John, for your question. I think there's been a particular challenge in rural communities and particularly island communities. There's been significant issues in terms of access to flights and ferries. So it's been really challenging for individual businesses to operate. As folks have mentioned, some of the capacity constraints on flights for getting product out of that. The reduced frequency and capacity of the ferry sailings have resulted in delays to food reaching island communities. Sometimes an extra day, which is not a great aspect for things. In terms of how businesses have fared, I think there's been a huge challenge for businesses. We've seen across the Highlands roughly 25% of the total workforce on furlough, which is about 60,000 jobs. There's been a particular increase in unemployment in different areas than we've experienced before, so particularly tourism hotspots around Portree, Fort William, Broadford, etc. That's been a real challenge for us. In terms of business resilience, I would say that businesses were traditionally, most of the businesses in the food and drink sector are small and medium-sized enterprises set up by individual entrepreneurs. They have not been particularly well capitalized in the past, and that's really hit them. So most of those businesses have not been sitting with significant cash balances, which has really been a challenge for them going forward. Many of them have been reliant on one particular market, often supplying the hospitality sector through hotels and bars, etc. And that has been a real challenge for them in terms of delivering to that. I think there's some lessons to be learned there about diversification for businesses in how they look forward to things, but it's been a really significant impact on many aspects of the most remote and rural parts of Scotland.
Thank you, David. Nick Halfide, you want to come in? Well, you're coming in now.
Yes, just very briefly. I mean, the situation in the south of Scotland is quite similar in many ways to the Highlands and Islands. To answer the question directly, I think it's been very varied. There have been a small number of businesses that have actually done very well out of this and that have been able to either pivot their businesses very quickly or who are providing things like PPE. And we have a number of companies in the south who've done hand sanitizer or PPE equipment who've done very well. We've been supporting them. But the vast majority, I think, absolutely, it's not been a good situation at all. Many of them have gone into hibernation. We've had very high levels of furloughing, around 30% of employees in the Borders and Dumfries and Galloway. Obviously, the hospitality sector in the more remote areas has been particularly important, has been particularly hard hit. But there have been a lot of rays of sunshine in the sense that a lot of businesses have shown great resilience, and some of them have even been fairly energized by this. So, and have worked with local communities in a very resilient way to help people through the most immediate negative impact. I think the difficulty is going to come in the months ahead, when even though as an agency and as a government we provided a lot of support to keep companies going, when they reopen and the markets aren't as robust, I think that'll be particularly challenging for many of them.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come very briefly to Julie and then back to John. Julie.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to add, I think our industry has shown particular resilience in the Highlands and Islands, especially where there were issues around, immediately around transport. Public transport, of course, is very poor in some parts of the rural communities. So companies have put, removed car sharing and put on different kinds of modes of transport for people in the Highlands so that they can get to their work more easily and social distance. Access to ferries was an issue for some of our members initially, but we moved quite quickly to get templates of letters so that they could demonstrate they were key workers and for their supply chain. So that was overcome quite quickly with help from the Islands Task Force. Access to testing has been a real issue, actually, particularly on the Western and Northern Isles, and getting COVID testing has been a major challenge, despite the clear guidance from the Scottish Government that it should take place. There's been huge progress, and there are some problems still in some of the islands like Orkney, but we hope that's going to be resolved soon. But our industry really, I think, has worked so hard over the time. Money is still flowing into Highland communities in the form of wages, very good high annual average wage in the salmon farming sector of 34k. Having that kind of constant input into the rural communities, I think, has been a real help over this period.
Thank you, Julie. Back to you, John. John Finney.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks to our witnesses for their contributions. A couple have mentioned connectivity issues. I wonder, can I maybe expand a bit on that? The witnesses, again, to the two gentlemen from the enterprise agencies, the Parliament's Information Service have produced a blog recently, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they say the local authority areas with the highest proportion of premises that fall below the universal service obligation are in rural areas. So I wonder, particularly with regard to things like home working, online communication, obviously, and transactions, can you comment on the impact of that, please?
David Oxley. David.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of folks have moved to home working quite well and quite quickly where that is possible. We've certainly seen anecdotal evidence of folks wanting to move to the area. I know the one thing that this crisis has caused is that everybody is as far away from everybody's the same connection away. So working in a remote and rural area doesn't make you're still as far away from London as somebody who's living in the next street to somebody in London. So I think there's some longer term possible advantage where we could see home working as an option going forward. I do believe that we have some significant challenges still to overcome across the food and drink sector in terms of how some of the current processes that have been put in place have effective. What we need to talking about is we've seen a lot of local activity, so folks are shopping local, using their local farmers market, local high streets to buy. That's great in the short term. I'm more concerned about the longer term aspects of whether consumers will stay with that or go back to their traditional areas. There will be some challenges around the hotel market, absolutely, and I think we still have a huge tsunami of redundancies to come, not just in the food and drink sector, but across the whole of the economy, and that will undoubtedly impact on the most rural parts of Scotland significantly. I think I've seen estimates of 10% unemployment across Scotland. The Highlands has typically had unemployment rates of 2 to 3%. So we're already seeing a significant impact of that.
Okay. Nick Harford, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just briefly on digital. I mean, what this has highlighted for us is a game of two halves, really. How good connectivity is and how quickly many people who are able to work from home have been able to do so, but also highlighted where that isn't really working, particularly if you've got multiple folk in a house trying to work and do homeschooling at once. It's been tricky. But the other thing really interesting it's highlighted is a gap in digital skills. Even where connectivity is good, it's exposed how some businesses have really struggled to get online. We've even had some businesses who've come to us to say, well, we want support from you, and we say go online, and they say, well, we don't really know how to do that. So there's a real skills gap, I think, for some businesses, but also for many households, and this will be particularly important when we're trying to get people back into work. So we can't just offer them a skills package digitally. We're going to have to find ways to help those that struggle with that to access the support moving forward.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much.
John, do you want a brief follow-up, or are you all right?
I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Convener.
Thank you very much, John. We'll go to the next question then, which is from Colin Smith. Colin.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. My questions are primarily follow-ups to John's and for Nick and David. Can I ask the two agencies, given that your role is really to deliver support that meets the needs of your specific areas, can I ask what specific support you've delivered for the food and drink sectors during the pandemic over and above administering the national grant schemes?
Nick, do you want to go on that?
Yes.
At the deep end?
In at the deep end, most of our effort has actually gone into these government grant schemes. As a new agency, starting on the 1st of April with very few staff, we've had to devote nearly all of them to these grant schemes, and a number of businesses in the food and drink sector benefited from those. But the other key thing I would highlight is the flow of information. We've spent quite a lot of effort trying to gather information locally from the food and drink sector, for example, and feeding that into government, and crucially helping local businesses access the information that government has been provided. So making sure that businesses have everything that they can, both in terms of influence, but in ability to adjust their own businesses.
Okay. Do you want to come back in, David?
Yeah, Nick is, I'd say similar to Nick, we have been hugely focused on particularly the resilience funds, and I think the food and drink sector was probably the second highest sector after the tourism and hospitality sector in terms of the amount of grants and money that went out, and it's not insignificant for High. I think we've put out across the whole of that fund, a particular fund, around £18 million, which is a significant amount of money across the region. I think where we've seen we've certainly been pivoting our support to provide information digitally across all sectors in terms of information through webinars and podcasts. We've seen a slight increase in demand for innovation, so folks wanting to look at how they can change their business model from that, and we've tried to provide some advice to businesses on that. Two areas that I think that I would mention that we have really been working closely with is firstly UK market development, which I think has to be the opportunity for most food and drink businesses going forward. It's great if folks can buy local, but many of the towns and villages across the Highlands and Islands, there's only a limited number of biscuits the local baker can sell in their small town, so they need to sell wider than that. So UK market has got to be the opportunity that they come to. So we're working very closely with Scotland Food and Drink on that aspect of things, and the real focus for businesses has been how to start up again. In some ways, closing down is relatively straightforward. You lock the doors and go away. Restarting in a safe environment has been particularly challenging. I live and work in Murray, and there's some very big food and drink companies here who've been very good at reopening safely and quickly, and we've been able to utilize some of the intelligence that they've gathered. Some of them have got they've learned from other countries. So some of the distillers, for example, had businesses that were opening up quicker in parts of Europe than we were. So there's been lots of learning from that, and we're trying to make sure that gets fed into Scottish Government for guidance for businesses as they go forward into the reopening phase.
Colin, if you'd like to follow that up.
Thank you. I mean, I want to come to future plans in a second, but can I just follow up on what you said there about the flow of information? I'm sure your inbox from food and drink sectors to David and Nick, it was very similar to mine in that a lot of the sector highlighted gaps in those schemes that you were administering, the 51,000 rateable value cliff edge, that the high proportion of self-employed people who couldn't apply for the grants because of the limits on not applying for something if they've had universal credit. Now, given that there were lots of food and drink sector businesses that weren't able to access support, was there ever any thought given to having a local grant scheme in your areas to meet the specific local needs of businesses in those areas?
Okay, Colin, I'm just going to go very quickly to David and then Nick. If you could answer that briefly, because Colin's indicated he wants another question. So, David first.
Yeah, I think many of the schemes were either specific to sectors or specific to a range of businesses. So the Resilience Fund, for example, was effectively open to all SMEs across Scotland, and it was really good to have that the funds that we were available to give out increasing over time, but it was a bit of a moving feast in terms of the budget that was available. It was 45, then 90, then 120 million, which is all great, but we were constantly getting applications through. I think what that has been able us to do is we've got much more intelligence on the needs of individual businesses, those that were successful and those that weren't successful. We are looking to see what we can do around supporting other businesses going forward, those that weren't successful. The reality is there's not enough money to go around. High is sitting with a budget cut in terms of revenue spend, which is where most of our support would go to these businesses. We've had a £4 million cut this year, 13% of our budget, so it is particularly challenging for us at this point in time.
Nick, briefly.
Yeah, as a new organisation, one of the first things we did was identify a section of our budget which we would make available as a hardship fund. That was overtaken by running the two funds from central government, but we still have some funds earmarked to support a range of companies across the south of Scotland, and we're already in dialogue with a number of those. Those are some that weren't successful through the existing schemes or weren't even eligible to apply in the first place. And our message to businesses in the south is come and talk to us because we're here to support you, and actually we do have some money available to do that.
Thank you. Colin.
Thank you, Mina. So looking forward then, can I ask, given the importance of the food and drink sector, how are you now planning to engage with that sector going forward? For example, I know in the south of Scotland, food and drink was never a priority area for your predecessors, SOSEP. So how will you engage with the sector and what needs to be done to help them rebuild?
Okay, we come to Nick first and then David, and I'd ask you both to give a couple of points briefly.
Yeah, food and drink is a priority for us in the south. It's an integral part not only of the economy, but how it links into other parts, the hospitality sector and others. So what our ambition is to talk to all the businesses, anyone who wants to talk to us. We're not just dealing with the big guys. Many of our companies are small and micro businesses. Come and talk to us, whether it's through Business Gateway or us direct, and we'll support you as best we can. Might be funding. It's more likely to be advice or directing to other areas of support. Though with a slight caveat, we only start on the 1st of April, so we are just still finding our feet, but we're here to help is our message.
And David. David, hold on, you appear to be muted. Hold on just 2 seconds. Try again. No, you're still muted. I'll give you one more attempt, or broadcasting one more attempt to bring you in, and then I might have to move to the next question. I might come back to you. David, do you want to try again?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Off you go, briefly.
Okay. So I think we've been feeding intelligence through that we've gathered. We're speaking to food and drink businesses and every other business on a daily basis to gather information. I think one aspect that we briefly touched on earlier was e-commerce. I think many of our businesses got caught out by that. I think there's definitely opportunities around helping businesses get online, whether it's your local butcher or baker or whether it's a manufacturer. I think that's something we're going to be looking at quite closely to see how we can support businesses improve their speed to market.
Thank you, David. Next question's from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Thank you, Convener. Before I go to my question, given that the impacts on islands has been mentioned in evidence, I should refer members to my register of interest. I own 3 properties in the Western Isles from which I derive no income. Turning to the environment, Convener, there's no doubt there's been an impact from COVID-19, not least the temporary regulatory changes made throughout lockdown. And there's clearly been impacts on the aquaculture, farming and forestry sectors. And to give just one example of many, peatland restoration is not permitted under current guidance. So can I ask our witnesses if there have been any impacts from the COVID-19 crisis on their particular sector's ability to meet environmental regulations or carry out planned land management, for example, the peatland restoration or tree planting or agri-environment interventions? It would be good to get some feedback on that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to come first to Johnny Hall and then I'm going to come to Julie afterwards. Johnny.
It's a very interesting question. Everyone has pointed to the fact that the lack of aviation and the lack of transport as a consequence of lockdown has certainly had an impact on reducing emissions. However, as an organisation, we recognise that the climate change challenge which we all face in terms of how we manage our land remains, and we still very much as an organisation and as industry are up to addressing that challenge. When it comes to the specifics around ongoing agri-environment schemes, we have been in a lot of correspondence with particularly ARPID within Scottish Government about the governance and the requirements around fulfilling contracts, and equally with the likes of SEPA and SNH, because clearly an awful lot of land-based inspections were put on hold, as well as particular operations put on hold, simply because of the safe social distancing requirements, etc. Nevertheless, on balance, I think most agri-environment management has carried on as usual. We are at a bit of a crossroads anyway in terms of how agri-environment will be pursued in the next wee while. We're coming to the end of the current Scottish Rural Development Programme, and we're still looking for assurances, etc., as to the continuity around some schemes and the continuity of management to deliver not only the existing challenges around biodiversity and compliance with existing regulation, but also, as I say, making an even greater contribution to tackling climate change, etc. So, this almost relates to where we go next with another piece of business for the committee, and that relates to the Scottish Agriculture Bill, which you've been dealing with recently. So, we're looking very much forward to 2021 to have that platform for continuity in order to ensure that schemes do persist and are properly funded, in order to then ensure that we continue to deliver. I suspect, and this is anecdotal, but apart from the hotspots of a lot of public access and recreation in and around towns and settlements, the countryside's been quite a quiet place. And anecdotally, we've heard a lot of evidence to say that biodiversity in particular has had a real opportunity of a very benign spring of good weather, and actually reports are that things like ground nesting birds, lapwings, curlews and all sorts of things like that are actually flourishing in some places, simply because of a lack of disturbance and an almost a reversion back to a farming system of days gone by, as it were. So you can read into that what you like, but I think in terms of meeting tree planting obligations and targets, other things like this, I think we're still on a curve whereby we we need to get things back up and running as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Johnny. Julie, come to you briefly, and then I can come to Elspeth, as long as your answers are both relatively succinct. Julie.
Sure, thank you. Well, starting, salmon is a pretty carbon efficient way of producing protein, so that's the point that we start at. The lockdown caused issues with getting regulators out onto site. That was tricky. SEPA have been very flexible in doing, remote audits and, dealing, working from home themselves a bit more, dealing with us in a more remote way. But that means not that regulation has stopped, it's just had to be done differently. Farmers have had to ask SEPA for regulatory relaxations. Regulatory flexibility, I should get that right. It's not a relaxation, it's a flexibility, in order for fish to be reared for longer periods, growing them to a larger size, keeping them in the water longer. That, I think, has had no impact on the environment. The sector's worked along regulators to develop risk assessments, making sure that only farms that are a very low risk are permitted to use the temporary measures. They've included evaluations of compliance history, proximity to marine features and modelling. And the sector has not really used any more medicines than before. Rather, we sought to be able to use the existing consented medicines in the management of our fish. So overall, the farming impacts, I wouldn't imagine would have been any different than they already would. But as Johnny said, there are huge reduced impacts in other areas of our activity, which I think overall the impact of the sector will have gone down.
Okay, Elspeth.
Thank you. Julie mentioned carbon footprint. I would just point out that the carbon footprint of Scottish wild-caught fish is extremely low, and indeed lower than some plant-based sources of protein in some cases. But the point I really wanted to make was just about the impact that COVID has had on some of the surveys that are needed to undertake fish stock assessment. So there's scientific work that's carried out by government, by Marine Scotland, and also by industry in terms of providing information that informs stock assessment for fisheries management for the future. So just to say that obviously a lot of that activity has been suspended during COVID, and there will be some there'll be some knock-on consequences in terms of the amount of data that will be needed for those stock assessments for the future. But I think now we are beginning to see that situation starting to improve, but there will be some gaps in the data compared to other years.
Thank you, Elspeth. Just before we move on to the next question, I just a very quick question, if I may, to Julie regarding the fish and the inability to harvest them, and therefore them having to be grown slightly bigger. Are you concerned with this warm weather and the warm sea temperatures that we've had this year, that there may be external problems for lice and gill disease, which may require more treatments, or am I worrying about something that's not a concern? Julie.
Well, yeah, this is the time of year when farmers absolutely need to be totally on top of, lice issues. So that's partly the reason why we asked for the regulatory flexibility, to make sure that the industry could absolutely stay on top of lice. So yeah, you're right, but I'm not too concerned. The lice figures currently are looking, about normal for this time of year, because farmers have worked really hard to keep them there. So at the moment, I'm going to jinx this now by even saying this. Things are looking steady, but that is part of the reason that the flexibility was asked for in the first place, so that we can stay on top of this and look ahead, into the difficult period, the end of August, September, October, when things do get difficult. If you get it right now, you don't end up with the problems later on in the year.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm actually going to go on to questions now from Rachel Hamilton. I'll come back to the member I've missed out a little bit later. Rachel, I'd like you, please, to go with the next question, please. Rachel Hamilton.
Thanks, convener. We've heard a lot about the business grant and support that has been given from the UK government and the Scottish government, and I have a number of specific questions. And I know that that David and Nick have already answered a number of them, but I'll go ahead with these questions, and it's really for anyone in the panel. So, how effective do you believe the support has been? Is there anything you suggest that would have been done differently? And if there's a flare-up in the virus and businesses have to close, do you expect government to intervene again? And finally, will financial support stave off job redundancies in your sector, or do you expect there to be a tsunami of job losses?
I think that's really to everyone. I'm going to go to Nick first, and then I'll come to Jimmy and anyone else who wants to come in. Nick.
I'll try and be brief. Those are the big questions. How effective? In the South, we've been able to support over 200 businesses, so that is good. We haven't been able, though, to support all the businesses in need. There was never going to be enough money to do that. Also, what we found, I think, is as individual businesses have approached us, some have actually been in genuine hardship and we've been able to support them. Others have had sufficient reserves to ride this out and therefore haven't needed government support. But what's also happened is it's when you kind of reveal the company's books, as it were, some of them have been really not very viable moving into this. And what COVID has done in a small number of cases is exacerbate what would probably have been closures in the short to medium term anyway. And I can think of another example, an energy company, where they were probably going to be moving to making redundancies. But what COVID has done is bring it forward. They've had to speed up their consideration. But it's a very varied picture across the South. We have already seen closures or announcements of potential closures, and I expect we will continue to see that, particularly from some of the smaller businesses, because the South has a predominance of micro and small businesses. And I think we will continue to see that coming through. So some of those will be headlines, others will not go into the papers, but we'll begin to see them coming through.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm going to come to Jimmy and then to David. Jimmy first.
Yes, well, I would like to put it on record the speed that the Scottish Government reacted for the seafood processing sector has to be applauded. They certainly moved very, very swiftly. They put a resilience fund in there that has definitely helped a lot of businesses from failure. And for that, the industry is extremely grateful. And it was the speed at what that was. I think there was over 120 companies were the beneficiaries of a sum of money. It was in excess of 5 million, I'm led to believe. But I don't think it stops there. I think I did speak about some sort of new normal services resuming, but there are still a number of businesses who are going to continue to need assistance in some shape or way or form, and especially in rural Scotland. And I think it's good that we maybe have that documented, and it's maybe something that we can take offline with some of the other key players that are interested to find out a bit more. I think there is more needs to be done, but we're certainly grateful of what was done in the first place, because it certainly did save many businesses, and importantly, the jobs that go with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. David, followed by Elspeth.
Okay, thank you, convener. I would just reiterate Nick's point. It's been said to me a couple of times that the way that COVID has impacted on businesses is similar to the way it's impacted on individuals. Those who had an underlying condition are more likely to be affected by COVID-19, and businesses that had underlying financial condition have also been most badly affected. I think the support schemes have been effective in keeping things going where possible. I think there's some difficult challenges coming up as we move into the restart and recovery phase of these. I think the furlough scheme in particular has been widely embraced by businesses, and that's the scheme that has really kept folk going and made sure they've not made major redundancies at this point in time. I think how that scheme is expanded or developed further over the coming months is the really important one, because I think without that furlough scheme in operation, I think the chances of large-scale redundancies not just in individual businesses, but across many small businesses getting rid of 2 or 3 staff, which cumulatively adds up to a really big issue. I think that is a real challenge.
Thank you, David. Elspeth, you wanted to come in, followed by Johnny Hall. Elspeth.
Thank you. Yes, just building on what Jimmy said about seafood processing, I think we too would want to put on record our thanks to the Scottish Government for the pace at which they moved to put in place financial support for the shellfish catching sector. They moved very quickly initially to provide financial support to the most businesses in terms of the small fleet, the under 10 metre fleet, and then there was further support in place for the over 10 metre shellfish fleet, which I think in total between these two schemes came in the region of about £9 million. The schemes weren't perfect, but they were quick and they were put in place and they helped a lot of people. And I would like to commend Fergus Ewing and his officials for the engagement and pace at which we were able to get that really badly needed support to the fleet. In terms of going forward, as I said earlier, I think we have particular challenges to address in the prawn fleet in particular, and that's something that we are going to have to look very carefully at and that we are talking to government about.
Thank you, Elspeth. We'll go to Johnny Hall next, then comes James Withers. Johnny.
Thank you. I'll just make a very brief point about agricultural businesses and their very diversified nature these days. An awful lot of agricultural businesses derive an income from out with agriculture, and a lot of that hinges around tourism and farm shop type activities and things like that. But particularly agri-tourism, I think, has been one of those areas that have fallen through the net in terms of the support that's been available. Primarily because a lot of things like holiday lets or campsites that are part of the agricultural business have not been recognised as businesses in their own right. So they've failed to meet some of the eligibility criteria, either around loan schemes or indeed some sort of grant support as well. So I think that there are some gaps in some of the support measures, and certainly in an agricultural business sense, some issues, and I would stress the agri-tourism side of it particularly, has struggled to access some of the support that's been available simply because of the setup of the business.
Okay, Johnny, I'll come to James Withers next, and then a brief supplementary from Rachel Hamilton, if there is one. So, James.
Thank you. Just a brief response to some of Rachel's questions there. I think I would echo the value of the response of the seafood sector and Scottish Government. I think moved very quickly. I would not for a second underestimate how important the pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund has been. It was a little slow to try and get money out the door, but it was overwhelmed with applications. And I think the trebling of that budget, that has been an absolute lifeline for a number of sectors. At UK government level, furlough has been critical, but worth noting, it's been less integral to the support for the food and drink sector than many others, because the food and drink sector, has not had lockdown, so to speak. It has had to keep moving to keep the nation's fridges and freezers full. You've had businesses that have been running a lot less efficiently because they might have lost 40, 50, 60% of the business they were selling into hospitality, but still require to maintain a lot of their fixed costs to maybe only supply 40% of their normal market into major retail. So actually, you've had an inability to use some of those mothball mechanisms that, for example, tourism and hospitality have used. The result will be a lot of businesses will come out of this crisis, many well-established businesses with a lot of the characteristics of new start businesses. Their balance sheets will be badly eroded, and they'll have a much more risk-averse approach and a lower appetite for investment. So my only other thoughts around, if we move into lockdown again, the kind of mechanisms I think we need to think about, the rates holiday, for example, that was applied to retail and hospitality, massively valuable for that sector, but didn't extend into their customers, so the people that were supplying those businesses, as an example. So big supermarkets benefited from a rates holiday, but not the food and drink suppliers that were supplying into them. Same for smaller retail, same for hospitality as well. And those kind of mechanisms could be important. And the final point is, I understand why there's an instinctive mechanism to support SMEs And most of the funding mechanisms, the grant funding mechanisms, have all been SME eligible, including Pivotal Enterprise Fund. The only options for larger businesses was access to debt. And we've got a small number of large businesses in the food and drink industry in Scotland that account for a huge amount of the turnover. And they are in generally, with the exception of probably I would put whisky to one side, in low margin sectors, with seafood processing being a good example of that. And I think we need to think about the mechanisms of how we support some of the businesses that are beyond 250 employees, given how important they are to the economy nationally and indeed locally.
James, thanks very much. I'm going to briefly go to Stuart Stevenson before we move on to the next questions, which will actually be from Peter Chapman. But Stuart Stevenson, I think you had a follow-up.
Thank you very much, Convener. My apologies, I had to be absent for a minute or two there. I just wanted to focus on the UK government's business support schemes for self-employed in particular, but more generally, if appropriate, in relation to the fishing industry, where, of course, we have a lot of self-employed people, but the structure of employment is a bit different in the fishing industry. I'm particularly thinking of the catching sector, but I know it will also apply to the processing sector. So I suspect I probably would like to see Elspeth, if she may, give an answer first.
Okay, Elspeth, do you want to kick off, and then I'll come to Jimmy Buchan. Elspeth.
Yes, certainly. Thank you. And indeed, the catching sector was relieved to see the self-employed support scheme come in from the UK government, because indeed, as Mr. Stevenson has said, there are a large number of self-employed spear fishermen. So that scheme certainly has been of value. Not all would have been eligible for it, but it has certainly been welcome. Obviously, the furlough scheme has been of value for those with employed crews, and the self-employed scheme has come in and certainly filled a gap for self-employed share fishermen. So, as I say, it won't have worked for everybody, but it has certainly been welcomed, and many will have taken advantage of it.
Thank you, Elspeth. Jimmy, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, there's not a lot I can really add to it. A lot of businesses would have, the business owners would possibly be under self-employed, but a number of them managed to keep operating. So I think some of the business resilience schemes they've been able to tap into. But I think it is an important point that was issued, it was raised earlier by James Withers about the business rates. I mean, some people did enjoy that, and others who have clearly were down to, it was reported, 40% capacity, still had the same overheads and are continuing on that vein. So although the resilience scheme that was put there initially to help them over a difficult period, that period may still be continuing for a number of our businesses. So again, it's something we need to keep a tight watch on.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. I'm going to move to the next questions, if I may, which are from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Yes, panel, we've been speaking a lot this morning about financial support in one way or another, but my question is about non-financial support. So do any of the panel have executive support, which has made a real difference? And James might want to kick off on this, because there's the Scotland Food and Drink, for instance, have set up a website for local food and drink suppliers to support the selling direct to customers. So I think that, to me, is a particularly good example. And as a follow-up to that, what role have rural businesses in your sectors played in providing support to local communities as well?
Okay, I am going to go to James first on this one. James Withers, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, so I think like any crisis, the ability to try and build community quickly has been important. I think actually just the speed of communication has been really important in a fast-changing environment, so businesses can try and understand, what rules are having to work to, what restrictions are having to work to. The Support Local website was a response very quickly. Crisis can be a catalyst for innovation, and certainly a lot of smaller food and drink suppliers quickly created e-commerce businesses on the back of it, recognising that their traditional route through restaurants and hotels and bars were gone. How do they supply directly? So as you say, Peter, we created this first national directory for anyone now in Scotland can search for people in their area that are supplying directly. David was making the point about e-commerce more widely. We've been running e-commerce development webinars the last week. If I'm honest, convener, if we'd have tried to get companies signed up for that a year ago, we might have toiled, and we're having to put extra dates on just now. And I think Peter makes a really important point about the mechanisms for support. And I think my sense, if we really want to fuel recovery now, we need to move slightly beyond a simple approach of injecting money into individual businesses and think about how we invest in the wraparound programs that will support all businesses. So that is about how we try and capture some of this momentum around local food, but maintain it for the longer term. So what does the next development of a national directory look like? Is it possible we could have a national e-commerce platform for food and drink suppliers in Scotland, run by them and for them? I think how we invest in programs to drive sales across the UK and exports is still going to be really important. How we invest in building Scotland's brand and activity overseas. Now that will probably mean we need to do virtual meet the buyer trade events with Japan and US in different ways that we've done it before. And I think one of the risks we have, if almost the further west you go across the world map, the further behind we are in the disease curve. So there's only really US behind where the UK is in the recovery trajectory, which means our competitors actually have got a march on us in getting back into markets as they reopen. So the investment we put in these wraparound programs now are going to be really, really critical. Our estimation, as I said, is we've lost £3 billion in the value of the sector. I think with some investment, and not much, by the way, we think something in the region of £10 million of investment over the next 2 years, we could regain that in the next 2 to 3 years. But it's now this wraparound program support that could help. And I think that will build actually on some of the positives we've seen from a business point of view come out from the local market opportunity, as well as what will be an international opportunity too.
Thank you very much, James. I'm going to go to Elspeth, and I'm going to go to Johnny Hall. Elspeth.
Thank you, convener. Just 3 things I would quite like to mention quickly. You said yourself earlier on, you spoke about the fish boxes that we're now able to buy. I think important just to recognise the contributions of bodies such as Seafish, who have indeed worked hard to try and support fishermen to actually undertake direct sales and to do much more pierhead sales, local sales, etc. I think that's been very, very useful in some parts of the industry. I think also Seafish, Seafood Scotland and the Scottish Government have worked collaboratively to do more work around campaigning and marketing in terms of encouraging people to perhaps eat different species of fish than they usually would, and just to encourage that greater uptake. And also Seafood Scotland have done some really good work with chefs to try and upskill chefs in terms of use of seafood for when they start to reopen. Just the final point I would like to make was, as well as things like financial support and business support, I think it's also important that we think about welfare and recognise the important contribution that charities have made to actually helping people through what have been very difficult times. And for example, on the fishing side, we've had Seafarers UK and the Fishermen's Mission, who have really played a very important role in making sure that individuals as well as businesses have had a port of call, somewhere to go to, somewhere to point them towards whatever perhaps financial, emotional and welfare support that they might need. And I think that's been extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elspeth. I'm going to go to Johnny Hall, followed by David Oxley. Johnny.
Thank you. I'll just echo Elspeth's last point there in particular about individuals' well-being throughout this process. I think in the first sort of 6 weeks of lockdown, the way in which we operated as an organisation shifted completely from being a lobbying organisation to being an organisation that simply was there to provide information and to signpost people to answer the many, many questions. Our website and the COVID-19 pages on our website has had unprecedented attention. So I think we've acted as a focal point for information, which has been essential in keeping agricultural businesses in the know. And that takes us to the point that there are about 18,000 individual agricultural businesses out there across Scotland, from Shetland down to Stranraer. And we've hit a time when, yes, farming is an isolated and can be a lonely business at the best of times. But in these times whereby we're now seriously not having things like agricultural shows to attend, there was no Highland show last week, etc. We've noticed that that's really starting to have an impact on some of our membership in terms of contact. But we're running far more meetings than we've ever run before. Our board is meeting every week. Our levels of member engagement are off the chart, really. And it's all about making sure we retain contacts and links, and people have an opportunity to feed in their views and things. And we've obviously been working very, very closely with Scotland's agriculture and rural charity, RSABI.
Thank you, Johnny. David, you wanted to come in, and then I'll come to Julie.
Yeah, very briefly, convener. So just three things I would point out. Firstly, I think the webinars and events that Food and Drink mentioned has been very important, and we've been working very closely to make sure there's coordination on those. The Fine Business Support Scotland website has really been developed as the place to go to for information, which I think has been useful for all businesses across. And I would just highlight the role that many businesses have used to support communities. Individuals who are furloughed or have been made redundant are facing the most difficult time of their lives. And we've seen many businesses step up, supporting local food banks and trying to make sure that those most disadvantaged in our communities can at least get enough food to keep themselves going.
Okay, thank you very much, Julie, and then I'll come finally to Jimmy. Julie.
Thank you. Two brief points. On non-financial support, the government support that we've had in their they've stepped in really and have helped with discussions and liaison with the UK retail sector has been really welcomed by our industry. Discussions with the retailers about what more they can do about getting British and Scottish food into the UK retail supply has been great. It's raising the issue. It's helping retailers think very carefully about where they buy their supplies from. The second point is to aid recovery going forward. The single biggest thing I think that would really help us in a non-financial support way is really the recommendation that Benny Higgins put to the First Minister earlier this week around a better regulatory system in many cases to help and aid food production be more efficient and more effective going forward. Salmon farming is stuck in this kind of regulatory regime where small farms are favoured over larger, more efficient, more effective farms. If we could break out of being bogged down in costly and inefficient ways of farming, I think that would really help us unlock recovery, and Scottish salmon farming would be really well poised to help with Scotland and the UK's recovery from COVID going forward.
Thanks, Julie. And finally on this, Jimmy.
Well, just very briefly, to reiterate what Elspeth said earlier, Seafood Scotland, Seafish, Scotland Food and Drink all have played a huge part in moving the industry forward. We spoke briefly about fish boxes, and these have certainly opened up a new opportunity for a lot of businesses. But we're very aware that selling direct from vessels it is well within the law, and it's above board. But we as an industry are very aware that we've also got to watch that regulations are being adhered to, because we are speaking about food, and we are speaking about certain species of shellfish, and there comes with that there is an element of risk. So some sort of regulation and body to oversee that everything is well adhered to would also be a good thing. So I just thought I'd put that in brackets.
Okay, and before I move on to the next question, just because I'm not getting any questions, I'll just make the point on the food boxes, if I may, or the fish boxes, is how nice it is for local produce to be able to purchase locally, and how important it is. And I think it'd be a huge sadness if we lose that. That's the only comment I'm going to make, and it's probably the only question or non-question I'm going to make as well. Rachel Hamilton, you've got the next question. Rachel.
Thank you, convener. My question is about the resilience of the sector. Today, we've heard you all speaking about the issues that have affected you, such as regulatory regime, packaging processing factories having an impact on supply, the supply chain, export market being closed, the key worker classification, and certainly seasonal workers. I wanted to ask you, did the pandemic expose a lack of resilience in your sector? And how are you going to take that forward?
Okay, Johnny, you're going to get to answer that one first. Johnny Hall.
Thanks, Rachel, for the question. I don't think the pandemic has exposed a lack of resilience in the agricultural sector. I think we were very aware of a lack of resilience in the agricultural sector in the first place. It has probably sharpened our focus around the need to, and as to the how we do something about that. The agricultural sector, depending on which aspect of the agricultural sector you're in, remains far too reliant on public support in terms of direct support payments, and currently under the CAP, and remains still getting an inadequate return from the marketplace for the investment made in producing the food that we eat. So I think there are two fundamental points to address. We need to switch the focus of support away from blunt area-based payments that simply incentivize inertia and don't incentivize innovation, and they certainly don't build resilience. And the sooner we do that, the better. That's maybe a conversation for another time. And secondly, we obviously need to look and focus on how the supply chain operates. And it goes back to James's point earlier on and my point earlier on about equity and fairness, yes, but also about transparency in the supply chain. We're seeing significant supermarket profits throughout this piece, and yet primary producer prices remain very much on a very much a cost of production basis, if that in some cases. So I think we've got a lot of work to do on the back of this, but I don't think the pandemic has particularly shone any special light on the situation facing Scottish agriculture. It might, although, act as some sort of catalyst alongside things like Brexit for change.
Okay, James Withers, do you want to come in, and then I'll go briefly to Jimmy Button. James.
Yeah, thank you, convener. Just a brief point. I actually think COVID-19 has demonstrated the resilience of our food and drink supply chain. So with the exception of toilet rolls and pasta, which I don't think the Scottish Food Agency can take too much responsibility for, I think actually in an unprecedented crisis and in a time of fear and disruption, to keep the shelves stocked in a just-in-time supply chain anyway was a pretty remarkable effort all round, and I think there's a huge amount of credit to all sorts of people. I think what it has demonstrated is how important the various links in the supply chain are. We've not mentioned our food and drink wholesalers as an example, who are an absolutely integral cog in the supply chain and facing huge challenges just now, but actually it was a credit to a huge amount of their work that we've been able to do the things that we hadn't done before, do food boxes to the vulnerable, swing more of the supply into NHS and care settings from what was hospitality and hotel industry. I think the one note of warning I would strike is that resilience for our sector will be built on having a balance of markets. It will be about local, UK and international. It will be about retail and food service. And actually, there's a risk that the message that comes from coronavirus might be a backward step on that, because actually the one area that has done okay during this would be if you had all your business just with the major supermarkets, because they were okay, and that's what I think it's really important that we don't see a retreat from other markets because of the nature of this pandemic, and don't say actually the future is just about major supermarkets, because they are critical and they're important, but actually resilience will be about building those strong linkages back with our tourism and hospitality sector. The food tourism opportunity is phenomenal in Scotland, and we should use the recovery of our tourism sector to accelerate that, and it will be about the export piece as well. But I think overall, keeping tables stocked and fridges full has been a pretty remarkable exercise in resilience for the whole supply chain. But going forward, we will need that balance of markets and balance of customers and regaining some of that we've lost.
Thank you, James. And I'm going to go to Jimmy Buchan, who will be the last one in this section of questions, because there are quite a few more questions to go. So, Jimmy.
Well, I think James was quite explicit there and reiterated just exactly what I was going to say. But so not to waste too much time, I think for us and probably for everyone in this call, it just shows the sheer importance of food security for our country. And I think the resilience of all in that sector to be able to do what we did under the circumstances, as James so rightly said, to keep the supermarkets, to keep food flowing, I think was everyone should be commended for the efforts right through the supply chain. It's not just about the primary producer, but everyone in that link till it finishes up on us food on our plates. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy, and I apologise to those people I haven't brought in, but Richard, I'd like to come to you with the next question. Richard Lyle, please.
Yes, thank you, convener. I think we should record our thanks to everyone, van drivers, suppliers, shop workers during this crisis, and also agricultural sector. Has the COVID-19 crisis highlighted resilience within the rural sectors? What policies or structures in place have helped to strengthen our rural sectors and communities? And what have you learned from this pandemic?
Thank you, Richard. I think Elspeth, as I didn't let you in on the last one, I'll bring you in first. So Elspeth, probably followed by David Oxley. Elspeth.
Yeah, thank you. Excuse my landline phone ringing in the background. It will stop in a moment. I think in our sector, we've always very much been at the mercy of factors that we can't control. So an industry clearly, obviously, very affected by weather, fluctuations in what is a natural resource. So I do wish that would stop. So I agree a lot. I agree with a lot that James said about building markets for the future, and I think there's a lot there that we all need to work through. I think what was really very clear to me, I mean, I've been only in the job for a relatively short period of time. I just joined this industry less than a year ago, but I think what was very evident to me over the last few weeks has been the way that the sector has pulled together, the way that we have collaborated, the way that we've been able to share information and working obviously within our sector, but also with that wider collaboration with the wider food and drink supply chain, with the wider food and drink stakeholder community, I think. So I think I agree also with the point that Johnny made. I think we all know that there will be issues of resilience in our respective sectors, or where resilience isn't as strong as it might be. But I think that there's been really strong cross-industry working to try and address these issues and to make us stronger and better for the future. And I think that there's a lot that we're all going to learn from this. And I think we already see that in our side, where I've mentioned 2 or 3 times already this morning that the problems we're facing with prawns going forward. There's discussions happening now across the supply chain that I think were probably not happening until this point.
Thank you, Elspeth. And I'm going to come to David, and then I'm going to go very briefly to Julie. David.
Thanks, convener. So I think just a couple of points I would like to mention here. I think the crisis has accelerated some of the thinking that was probably going to come into place with Brexit looming anyway, about that resilience factor of making sure that you haven't got all your eggs in one basket. I think some businesses work out, particularly if they had a strong food service offering. I suspect that the biggest change we'll see, and we may look back on this and say it was a real turning point for the food and drink sector, was that we can potentially accelerate the need to not rely on cheap migrant labour coming in to support the sector in whatever region it was. I think the demand for automation and innovation, so that we are keeping jobs at a sustainable level, at a higher paid level in the sector, I think is a real opportunity for the sector going forward. And I think that'll be the thing that we look back in a few years and say this was the point when that really changed from being potentially low value jobs to higher value sustainable jobs.
Thank you, David. I will go next to Julie, if I may, briefly, Julie.
Yeah, learnings for us. Really quickly, the government and many of our regulators and stakeholders came together really super fast to deal with issues, because there was a burning platform for us to do that, and it's really showed that where there's a will, there's a way to speed up decision making in a way that's still robust and transparent. So that has been really great. The collaboration that we've had with our regulators and government has been exemplary, and I want to thank them for that. In terms of resilience, the industry, my sector has been able to bear up to seismic challenges, and salmon farms and all of their supply chains deserve absolute credit for that, and thank you, Richard, for pointing that out. One area that I think it has shone a light on, and I think we need to learn, and that's to be a little bit more self-sufficient in our transport infrastructure in Scotland. Being able to get chilled salmon out of Prestwick directly instead of trucking it down to Heathrow, for instance, would be fantastic. And if there is this will, then let's find a way to, I don't know, help Scotland be more self-sufficient without relying, on other parts of the UK to deliver chilling facilities and freezing facilities and warehousing facilities for us. Let's do this better and more locally.
Thank you, Julia. And I think that's a good point to move on to the next question on this, which is from John Finney. John.
Convener, I do beg your pardon. I don't have a question at the moment. Thank you.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. If
I could ask it if you want, Convener. I can ask it if you want.
Mr. Lyle, I'm sure Mr. Finney will be delighted with your helpful support. If it's brief, Mr. Lyle, please.
Thank you, Mr. Lyle.
Right, basically, as a COVID-19 recovery, have you any thoughts on how we can create better resilience, sustainable local economies? The point Julie made, flying out of Prestwick, that we could get fish frozen and fly. Do things better. We don't need to use Gatwick or Dover ports. Could we do things more from Scotland than through England?
Thank you. And because Julie's has answered the first part of that, I think what I'll do is I'll ask James and then Jimmy for one brief suggestion each, if I may. James.
So I would support the transport and logistics piece, which is a piece that we were trying to deal with in the run-up to a potential form of no deal and Brexit, and actually some of that prep work turned out to be quite useful as we hit a pandemic. My one reflection would be on recovery is community-based approaches. It strikes me that this particular industry that our panel represents has a huge potential role to play in tackling some of the bigger national challenges that flow through down to our community. So we've got a huge youth unemployment problem now looming. We have a continued drive towards net zero, and I suppose as a convener inadvertently demonstrated earlier, rural connectivity issues. I actually think our industry and businesses, as we invest in that, have a huge opportunity to invest in, for example, 5G, 4G, 3G, and actually spread that through communities as well at the same time. So there's something about how this industry, I think, is uniquely placed, I would say as well, with alongside tourism, in being able to address these broader national issues that we've got just now, and seeing it in that perspective, less about what Scotland can do to support the food and drink industry, but a bit more about what our industry could do to support these wider challenges, I think would be quite a good approach to take.
Thank you for that. And I'll come to Jimmy Buchan, if I may. Jimmy.
Yes, well, I would just like to add to what's already been said. I think Julie raised some really important points there. And salmon is a global export entity, and I think there's a great opportunity for the wider seafood processing sector to tap into that. I suppose the one thing it does restrict that to a bigger degree is our dependency on a hub for that export. And I think Julie highlighted we maybe do have infrastructure. We need to invest further in it. and make sure that we're tapping into every opportunity. Brexit is on the horizon. It looks like it may happen, and for that reason there will be more fish available. That means that processing is going to have to either find a bigger home market, or we've got to look at a bigger, wider global market. So I think that is really important. We start that debate and we get in that room and we start to work collectively with the Scottish and the UK government to find solutions, and not only find solutions, but find new innovation, new ways of how we can do recovery, and which will benefit all of the community.
Thank you, Jimmy. And very quickly, going to come to Nick on that. Nick.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on the local market and making more of the local market, and make the point that within a 2-hour drive of the south of Scotland, we have a market of 14 million in the north of England. And the south of Scotland is also the gateway to both Northern Ireland and the Republic. So let's make more of what our immediate market, which is actually very close to some of our prime agricultural land in the south and some of our big processors. So there is an immediate market we can make more of, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm going to move to the next questions, which are from the Deputy Convener, Maureen. Maureen.
Thank you very much, Convener, and can I thank all the panel for their contributions today. They've been really useful, and I think I'm looking forward to looking back to the official report to just capture all that's been said. You know, this COVID pandemic has been a real shock to all systems, and I just wonder, in terms of building back better, which I hope we all want to do, is what are you doing now that you think you don't need to do anymore? And in terms of what everybody wants, I think, is, you know, a green, inclusive recovery. What do you think each of your sectors will look like, and what changes do you think need to be addressed post-COVID? You know, it was great that you mentioned that it's highlighted that some businesses really do operate on the edge and they need to think about whether they should continue. So in that sense, you know, how do we make sure that rural businesses and rural communities are sustained going forward? I suppose it's just kind of wrapping up what you've all really helpfully said this morning.
Thank you, Maureen. I'm going to go to James Withers first, followed by Johnny Hall. James, you want to try and tie that together?
Yeah, so I think the point that Nick made about the value of the local market and also sustainable local supply chains. I think we've seen a market across the UK become very centralised, whereas actually at times of disruption, it's local supply chains that can be amongst the most resilient. And if we can start building those supply chains with primary producers, farmers, fishermen at their heart, rather than often being at the final point of a transaction down the supply chain, I think we will be in a much better place. And actually, I think a lot of the behaviours that we have seen, people are less likely to go into an airport, hang a size supermarket to do their shopping, and may more likely to do it online, click and collect, delivery of local suppliers. There's a moment in time just now to capture the momentum around that, or else I think David is right what he said earlier on, that could dissipate. So actually, I think that's the industry's responsibility to try and grasp that now. And if we do that, then I think that will instinctively drive the kind of green recovery that we want to do, which will be at the heart of Scotland's food and drink offer, which is climate-friendly food production.
Thank you, James. Johnny Hall. Johnny.
Thanks, Convener. I think COVID in itself doesn't present any specific unique challenge to the agricultural sector, but what I do think it does is compound other existing challenges that we know we are going to face. Been little or very little mention around Brexit. We also know that from our industry's point of view, our contribution to meeting net zero is going to be critical as well. So as an industry, we already feel the pressure of significant challenges. We don't know what the future relationship will be with Europe. We don't know what future trading arrangements we will have with non-EU countries. We do know that we're leaving the CAP. So I think critically, and as I said earlier, the committee's obviously deliberated an awful lot over this already. Critically, it's what platforms are put in place to allow or enable a degree of certainty and continuity for Scottish agriculture in 21, 22 and beyond. And obviously in relation to that, the Scottish Agriculture Bill is key. But it's not just about continuity and retention of the status quo, far from it. It's about how we use that platform for stability in the first place, but also a platform to bring about change. And I actually think there is huge opportunities for Scottish agriculture and the whole of the food and drink sector of Scotland if we manage it in the correct way. Because whilst COVID, Brexit and other things apply pressure to us, it's out of pressure that we will bring about innovation, change, resilience and all the rest of it. And if that means a significant restructuring of Scottish agriculture, so be it. But I think we need to manage the consequences of that very carefully also, because there's obvious knock-on implications in other ways. But we have to grasp this as an opportunity rather than fear the fallout of COVID, Brexit and all these things being all too difficult and all too onerous for us.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Elspeth, followed by Nick, and then I'm going to come back to Maureen Watt. Elspeth.
Thank you. Yes, and a number of the other contributors have mentioned obviously Brexit and that coming towards us at the end of this year, and certainly the SFF has made no secret of the opportunities that it sees to be able to catch far more of the fish in our own waters. So that is very much this industry's ambition in terms of not being in the common fisheries policy from the end of this year, being able to control access to UK waters and having a fairer share of the fish that are caught there. So I think there are real opportunities for the sector to flourish. I think, again, going back to some of the things that Jimmy said about making sure that the benefits that this can bring can be applied right through the supply chain, the wider supply chain, the processing sector, etc. And I think in terms of the point about a green recovery, it's encouraging that as the fisheries bill that is going through the UK Parliament at the moment has a number of fisheries objectives that will underpin all of that, and climate change is very much at the heart of these, and I believe that's something that the Scottish Government was very keen to promote in its work with the UK Government and the other devolved administrations on the bill. So I think that's the direction of travel for us for the future, a future out with the common fisheries policy, being able to catch more of the really tremendous product in our own waters, and being able to extend that benefit through the supply chain.
Thank you very much, Elspeth. And Nick, before I go back to Maureen. Nick.
Yes, I just wanted to offer a comment on something we haven't talked about yet, but which is one of our underlying challenges moving forward, and which COVID in some ways has just highlighted. It's around the rural depopulation, and I really mean by that working age population, which is a real problem in the south of Scotland, but it is in many other rural areas, and particularly remote areas. Before we moved into COVID, we had pretty high employment, and we were actually struggling to fill some sectors, particularly in the care sector, and also some of the new opportunities. We were struggling to match existing people of working age with the new skills required. Simply just weren't enough people of working age. And I think that is an increasing problem, and it's projected to increase in the future. So I just don't want to lose sight of that. We do need to attract more working age people into rural areas and keep those that we have, if we're going to sustain many of our existing businesses, let alone realise some of the opportunities which we hope will be there through the green recovery.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I'll come back to you, Maureen. Maureen.
Thank you, convener, and thanks for that, folks. One of the things that, if we're going to reduce mileage and in tankers and things like that, it does mean that we should be adding value to our primary products more locally. So it does mean perhaps more creameries, more cheese making. You know, if we're catching more fish, we need to be processing it and adding value to it in Scotland before it's exported. Okay, we've still got raw fish exports, but all of these things, the industries need to be telling us as governments, I think, what we need investment in terms of these kind of adding value industries if we're going to meet our targets, for example.
I think that is an excellent point that you raise, and I'm delighted you've raised it. And I think I would like to summarise by saying, right now we can survive, but really we need to thrive. And for that to happen, we need the investment. The SSA, the Scottish Seafood Association, has now started that journey. We are prepared to come out and say what we need going forward. We're putting a paper together, and we certainly will be getting it to you very, very soon. But that is absolutely pivotal to the future post-COVID, post-Brexit. We really have all got to start working cohesively, with energy, with enthusiasm, and I'll tell you something, we can make this work, but it needs everyone on board, all pulling in the same direction. And it's a great point that you raise, and thank you for raising it.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. And I noticed one or two other comments coming in from on the chat side of it that won't just be Jimmy that's submitting a list of requirements. But I'd like to go to Mike Rumbles. You've been quiet for the meeting. Mike, you've got some questions now, I think.
Thank you, Convener. I only have one question I'd like to direct to Johnny Hall. As we all know, the Scottish Government is working on a bespoke system of cultural support from 2024. So what I'd like to know from Johnny and the NFU is how or if the current COVID-19 emergency affected how the NFU wants to see this new system of support established and implemented.
Okay, Johnny, that's your question.
Thanks, Mike. I don't think COVID in its substance at all. Our position on the need for a more effective and more focused agricultural support system in the future was born out of Brexit, and that being a fundamental catalyst for change to move away from, as I said earlier, blunt area-based payments and the CAP, more targeted support related to productivity, building resilience, and delivering on environmental obligations. So our approach is, if anything, has been sharpened. Our focus is sharpened. Our sense of urgency around getting this done sooner rather than later has probably sharpened as well. Having said that, though, the only note of caution we have is that really we are going into particularly uncharted waters in a 21 period, Brexit and the hangover of COVID, when we know public finances will be particularly under significant pressure. We know we need to build broader economic recovery across Scotland and the UK. And therefore, I think the challenge becomes even greater, the move to a system that delivers more than just support payments to people who occupy areas of land. But our determination to change things, Mike, has not taken a backward step at all. And I think we need to keep the pressure on Scottish Government to deliver on its commitment. We'll see what happens in the next few weeks and months, but certainly moving into 21 is the opportunity to bring about change in a meaningful way.
Mike, do you want to follow up on that?
No, thank you. I think Johnny's response was pretty good. I fully understand what he's saying. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. And that really completes our questions and answer and concludes this evidence session. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. We seem to have got through most of that, and Maureen stepping in her deputy convener role has proved that I was superfluous for a while, but that broadband isn't. So I would actually thank you all very much for all the evidence that you've given this morning. I'd like to move now on to agenda item 3, which is the consideration of 2 negative instruments as detailed on the agenda. Sorry, Maureen, did you want to come in at this stage? Sorry, you had your hand up.
People going away.
Sorry. I'm trying to do 2 things at once. I think you are as well. So we're going to move on to agenda item 3, which is consideration of 2 negative instruments. And you'll note from the meeting papers that one is the Plant and Health Official Controls and Miscellaneous Provisions and Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland's regulation is actually in breach of the 28-day requirement between laying and coming into force. A letter has been received from the Scottish Government explaining the breach, and the letters were in the public papers. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered this instrument yesterday and has reported the breach to the Parliament. The DPLRC was content with the reasons for the breach. I would say to members that there have been no missions to annul have been received in relation to these instruments. And Mr. Stevenson, I note that you do want to speak on this, and thank you for the forewarning of that. Stuart, briefly, please. Or is it the next item?
The next item.
Okay, so no one wants to speak on this. As no one wants to make any recommendations, unless anyone does want to make any recommendations. So I think that we're agreed that we don't want to make any recommendations and that we're happy to allow them to move forward as is. I would like to move then on to agenda item 4, which is the European Union Withdrawal Act. We have received a consent notification in relation to one UKSI as detailed on the agenda. This instrument is being laid in the UK Parliament in relation to the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. I'd like to point out there are several issues highlighted in our papers about not only the very short timescale for the committee to consider this notification, and it is also that this has prevented the committee from seeking specific additional information on the SI. Stuart, you wanted to make a comment on it.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just a couple of points. I mean, first of all, given that this is not going to take action till the end of the calendar year, I'm not entirely clear why we are in a position of not having time to consider it. By the way, I can't find anything in the substantive proposal that I've got great concerns about, but I've looked at it at modest length. But it raises a broader issue, which flows from a report that was produced by the Environment Committee, of which I'm also a member, in the last few days, about how UK SIs, where UK ministers are using SIs to legislate within Scottish Parliament competence. And I'm not going to go into huge details on that. But I think what it leads me to, one of the conclusions I think we should take, by the way, the Environment Committee report caused no division across the various political parties in the committee, was unanimously supported. That in making our report, I think we should be looking for a joint, both parliaments being involved in the procedure of laying and approval for this and similar ones. Now, that is not to permanently remove from more rapid consideration things where there's a matter of urgency, and I'm not trying to do that. In this case, there is no urgency that I can see, and I think we should report that this should be something that's considered by joint process. So my concern is process, not content. Convener.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. I don't see that any other member wishes to raise any points on this. I think the principle that Stuart makes is an interesting one. I think that once it is laid before the Parliament, we have a duty to consider it within the timescale that's laid before us, and that is slightly restricted by the fact that Parliament is due to go on to recess at the end of this week, which has driven the timetable. I take your point, and I think it would be apposite for the committee to note those comments when responding to the government. But I also, on the basis that no one's come up against this, that we write to confirm our consent to the UKSI as referred in the notification. I'm assuming that's agreed unless I see anyone typing in the chat room. No one has typed in it, so that is what we'll do. What we are now going to do is move it into private session, and as this will be on another means, I would ask committee to move there as soon as possible, ready to restart at let's say 11:15. That gives us 6 minutes to move across and to the other means. Thank you for your attendance so far. Thank you, committee, and I'll see you in 6 minutes on the other means, and I suspend the meeting at this stage. Thank you.